If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. Welcome to Considering Catholicism. I'm Greg Smith, your guide to the faith, life, and civilization that is historic Catholic Christianity. If you have any thoughts, any questions or comments, you can always send me an email to greg@consideringcatholicism.com. And would you like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts? And please share it with friends or on your social media so that we can grow our audience and enlarge the conversation. Now, one of our periodic features are the book club episodes. Cory and I both love Catholicism and novels. And so, in book club, we talk about some of our favorite Catholic novels. Today, we've got a book that has been strongly recommended by both of the last 2 popes, Benedict XVI and Francis. It's Lord of the World, published in 1907 by the English author Robert Hugh Benson. Benson was the son of a prominent clergyman in the Church of England who scandalized his family when he converted to Catholicism and became a Catholic priest and an author. Benson's story takes place 100 years in the future from when he wrote it, so basically in the time that we're living in now. And he imagined not only a world of advanced technology, but of advanced secularism and the persecution of Christians. In Benson's novel, human society, in one sense, hits its high point, but more importantly, its low point, as a world government emerges under the leadership of a charismatic leader who ends up being the fulfillment of the biblical Antichrist and who brings the world to its last day. Shh! It's time for book club. So, Cory, welcome back to book club.
Thanks. Good to be back.
Now, Cory, the listeners are subject to our whims and tastes.
Indeed.
And because it's our book club and not theirs. And so in terms of what books we choose, and we both are fans of the genre of science fiction.
Indeed.
And, science fiction comes in a lot of different flavors. There's hard science fiction, which, I grew up reading and loving, where the focus is really on the science.
And trying to make it more realistically scientific.
Yeah, it's exploring the science of it all. But aside from that, there's another kind of, we may call sort of softer science fiction, where it allows an author to sort of build a world in which they can tell a story sort of unconstrained by reality.
Right,
and facts.
Yeah, the facts of today or yesterday, sometimes called speculative fiction, because it's basically just pitching the story out into the future where you can build around it a setting that allows you to tell the story that you couldn't tell with today's reality.
Or historical fiction or whatever.
Right.
And so a lot of fun science fiction or good science fiction is that sort of thing where the author is able to sort of construct a little bit of an alternative future where they can focus on a story and see where that plot goes. And so what's interesting is that there's actually quite a bit of science fiction that's Catholic. Many Catholic authors. And because we love science fiction, we're Catholics, and this is a Catholic book club, we're going to talk about some Catholic science fiction.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
So today we're going to talk about Lord of the World, but we have some other books that will be coming up soon in the book club. You want to talk about some of those? Yeah.
So one of my favorites, A Canticle for Leibowitz, we're going to do soon. We also have been reading a Michael D. O'Brien novel, a contemporary author, his foray into science fiction, A Voyage to Alpha Centauri. And then we are hoping to cover some other books that weren't written by Catholics, but on our spectrum that we talked about in the intro episode certainly have Catholic themes and are relevant. So that would include Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, That would include C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, books like that. So there's a lot of places we can go, and I'm hoping as we continue with book club, we can find some more as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So today it's Lord of the World by Robert Hugh Benson, and it is a work of that sort of science fiction. In which, and I think it's a good example of the softer version of science fiction, because it really is just sort of an alternative vision of the future. He's looking 100 years or so into the future. Book written in 1907, and he's looking, into, well, would have been today,
right?
Sort of predicting a century out. And the science part is pretty soft. I mean,
yeah, he's not focusing on it. Like, he projects some new technologies that they didn't have in 1907, which, some of it's interesting, some of it's kind of silly. But
they have sort of what he imagines airplanes will be like, and what he imagines like telephones might be like, and some of those things.
It's not really important to the plot, except in a few instances.
Right. So. But it is a work that projects from things that Benson was seeing in his day. And if you almost think of where you've got a graph where you have a data trend, and then you just project that trend out into the future, he was just projecting out things that he was seeing around the turn of the 20th century and imagining what they might be like around the turn of the 21st century today.
Right. And that's mostly political and religious trends.
Yeah. And cultural and whatnot. So, with that being said, why don't you give a synopsis to the book? And by the way, again, at book club, there's going to be spoilers because we're not doing book reviews. We're discussing a book. So, but knowing where this thing is going is not going to change whether this is worth reading. So,
absolutely.
Go ahead.
All right. So the novel opens with essentially a world building section, or something that allows you to get the context of where we are in this imagined history. So you have two priests who are interviewing this aging, dying man who used to be in Parliament. This is all taking place in England. And they're basically getting the summary of how did we get here from the last 100 years. And so you're getting a lot of details about this imagined political and religious future, and how essentially a socialist government came into power in England and in the rest of Europe, that there's this essentially European confederation or state. There's also now a Asian state, megastate, and an American, North and South American megastate. So it's a little bit like if you are familiar with 1984, you have kind of these three giant power blocks. And in America and in Europe especially, it's dominated by this socialist or communist collectivism that's a secular state. On the religious front, most, if not all, of Protestant and other religious groups besides the Catholic Church have faded away under the pressure. The Church of England was disestablished long ago. And so really you have religiously and ideologically the dominant secularism of the state and of the dominant culture. And then you have the Catholic Church, which is standing athwart this.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago Orwell's 1984, and that's a book that has been compared to Lord of the World.
Sure.
Orwell wrote that book after this one, but they both have some parallels in that they both see not only the secular government, but they see socialism, leftism, Marxism, and that it is socialism, leftism, Marxism that has taken over and become an all-powerful, all-controlling government that dominates every aspect of people's lives for supposedly the collective good, yet is run by an elite at the top who manages life and outcomes for everybody below.
Yeah, and to be clear, that was essentially a stated goal of global Marxism. It wasn't, these people having kind of fever dream.
Still is.
And of course, Orwell, being several decades down the road, had some more context. He was after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, whereas Benson is before it. But you're already seeing things happening along those lines that Benson would have experienced.
Now, the interesting thing is that the premise of this book is that global socialism, if we think of Marxism as a worldview, which is my contention, and socialism is actually a political program, what you have is this sort of Marxist socialist vision, which is, for Benson, completely antithetical. And you'll say a minute, he makes that antithesis very, very clear in this book. You can unpack that. But it is antithetical in the sense of being diametrically opposite to Catholicism. And I think what's a little bit interesting about that is that in our last book club episode, we talked about Graham Greene's Power and the Glory, which was a real incident, it was obviously a fictional story, but based on the historical incidents that occurred in Mexico when a Marxist socialist government worked to exterminate Catholicism.
And only about a decade after Benson is writing this novel.
Right. Yeah. So it's a real thing, and it is the extermination of the Catholic Church by the philosophy of Marxism, socialism.
Yeah. So you have all of that context laid out for you to paint the picture. And then you're told that right now, the big deal is that there's a threat of war between this European state and this Asian state. And everybody's very concerned about what's going to happen with that. And there are rumors that there's this American senator that nobody really knows very much about, Julian Felsenburgh, who's kind of going around in the East and trying to negotiate this situation. And there are rumors flying and nobody really knows exactly what's happening out there. In this context, you're introduced to your protagonist, Father Percy Franklin, who is a priest in London at the cathedral there. And you're seeing him ministering in this situation of not open persecution at the beginning of the novel, but definitely antagonism towards the church.
Yeah, Catholicism had not yet been, at the beginning of the novel, not yet been outlawed.
Right.
Yet, and sort of tells you where the novel's going. But it was marginalized, otherized, disenfranchised in pretty significant ways, not only in England, but throughout Europe.
Right, and America. This is kind of a situation throughout.
The global socialist, Marxist socialist left, which has come to dominate, the world's governments. And I think what's interesting, too, just to point out that at the beginning of the novel, Benson makes the point, or the narrator makes the point, that Protestantism had already faded away. And I think that's an interesting thing and it becomes material in the rest of this book, because Protestantism ultimately didn't have the right stuff to withstand the ideology of Marxism, socialism. And so it was left to Catholicism as to be the true thesis to which the left is the antithesis. Yeah.
And I think when you read the book, you get a pretty good sense of why Benson feels that. Part of it is, of course, that he's a convert from the Church of England into the Catholic Church. So obviously this is very important to him. He's sort of zealous for portraying the Catholic Church in that way. And then we'll also see over the course of the novel how the papacy is very important in the church and in Benson's understanding and vision of the church, and how the church is held together in this situation of increasing persecution. So that's where you start. We're also introduced to two characters, Oliver Brand and his wife Mabel. Oliver is a high minister in the government in England, Mabel his wife, and you have a subplot where Oliver's mother, who used to be a Catholic in her childhood, is approaching death, and she actually seeks to be readmitted into the church. And that's how you have the intersection of Father Franklin and the Brand family, because he ends up in that situation. So you have these characters being introduced into this situation. And then, as I mentioned before, you have Felsenburgh rising to power. He essentially, through his charismatic negotiation, he neutralizes this threatened war between
he brings world peace.
Right.
And so now he is the savior. Literally, he's called the savior of the world because he issues in the new age of eternal peace in the world. Right.
And you have this literal religious fervor arising around him, and him drawing all the nations together, and essentially, bringing about this new age, a secular messianic age. And you have that being very strongly opposed by the church, and particularly by the Pope.
So at the time of this book, it's interesting, Rome has become like the last citadel, like the last fortress.
Well, it's funny because it's Rome and Ireland.
Right, Rome and Ireland are the last citadels, but Rome has really become this sort of citadel of of Catholicism and Christianity in the world. I want to talk about a little bit about that.
So the Pope is ruling Rome as a kind of independent city-state. Christians, Catholics from all over the world have come there. It's the center and capital. There are, of course, Catholics all throughout the world as well, but it's kind of the city on a hill. And we have also introduced early in the novel this striking similarity between Felsenburgh and our protagonist.
They just say physically.
Yeah, they look identical. People are very confused. It's like, wait, I just saw him and you look exactly like he does. And so through the course of the events of the novel, Franklin ends up in Rome in his role of basically being a go-between or bringing news of what's happening in the church in England to the Vatican, to the Pope. And then you have this crisis, this situation in which there's essentially a Catholic plot against Felsenburgh that's happening in England.
Hold on a sec.
Yeah, go ahead.
An important point there is that the rise of Felsenburgh, he gets named to be the president of Europe, and essentially he gets named to be the president of the world.
Right.
And it becomes alarming to the Pope. The Pope, and now again, the backdrop of all of this is that they're looking at biblical prophecy. And the biblical prophecy is the prophecy of the rise of the Antichrist, that eventually there'll be one who will bewitch the nations, who will pose as the man of peace and savior of the world and Lord of the world, but he's not Christ, he's the Antichrist. And the Pope in Rome is seeing the rise of Felsenburgh, who's consolidating power and launching a new religion.
Right.
You can say something about
this
that.
humanistic religion that he's launching.
It really is a literal religion. We talk about that for a second.
Yeah.
And as the Pope sees this rising, he reads the signs of the times and understands who Felsenburgh is, that he is the final manifestation of Antichrist, the biblical Antichrist. Say a little bit about this religion that Felsenburgh institutes.
Yeah, so it is meant to be based. Well, it is in the context of the novel based on Masonic rites. Little background, especially in the early 20th century, the Masons are very opposed to the Catholic Church, and there's repeated statements in real life of the Church saying that Masonic ideology and practice is antithetical to the Church. You can't be a Mason and you can't be a Catholic.
Yeah, and I think that's hard for readers today because Masonry qua Masonry isn't as prominent or visible.
Well, and in America, it's often looked less threatening.
Right, but the principles or the ideology of Freemasonry is the dominant, I would say, the dominant ideology of the left, even in the United States. So you might talk a little bit about it. It's humanism writ large.
Right. Yeah. So what you end up with is this religious worship that's centered around the worship of humanity in a few different guises.
Pantheism.
Right. And the universe. Yeah. So in the guises of motherhood and fatherhood, of these different kinds of natural things, it's a worship of collective humanity, that each individual person is sort of a cell in this giant body that is being worshipped. And Felsenburgh,
which the universe has given birth to,
right.
And that we worship the processes of the universe. We worship this, and none of us, as you say, is important because all of us, all that matters is the collective. And then you can Felsenburgh.
Yeah, and Felsenburgh is seen as sort of the manifestation, the ultimate manifestation of the universe, of humanity.
He's the sort of the apex of human evolution.
Right. He's a messiah in this religion that they've constructed.
So he sets us up, and they begin to require that everyone adopt the new religion. Talk about that.
Right. Yeah. They make these quarterly worship services mandatory, and
they take over churches, and they erect new symbols in the churches, new ceremonies in which this sort of collective pantheism is, and citizens are required to attend.
Right.
Legally.
At first, at pain of imprisonment.
Yeah. Now, all of this is, of course, Benson is drawing on historical parallels. So this is essentially the requirements under the Roman Empire for worship of the emperor, worship of the empire, the whole cult of the empire.
Right.
And you must periodically show up as a citizen and make at least token acknowledgement.
Yeah, and he's certainly drawing upon his English context too. In the English Reformation, the establishment of the Church of England, the requirement of worship in those churches that alienated Catholics and cut them off from the body politic in the country.
So the Pope sees the rise of this, reads the signs of the times, and says, this is the rise of the final manifestation of Antichrist. That's a whole nother conversation another day in terms of what the Bible teaches about Antichrist. But there's the Bible, I think a Catholic viewpoint is that Antichrist is a spirit opposed to Christ, but there is a final, and there have been Antichrists. In other words, there have been people who were leaders of opposition, but there is finally coming to some culmination at the end of the age before the return, second coming of Christ. There is a final manifestation of the spirit of Antichrist. And that's what the Pope recognizes as going on.
Right.
And that sets the stage for this conflict. So as you get to the end, there's two leaders in the world. There is the Antichrist, leader of this global socialist, humanitarian, pantheistic Marxist religion, and there's the Pope in Rome.
Right. And so in that context, in the context of this new worship having been established under Felsenburg's leadership, you have the Pope urging Catholics throughout the world to keep the faith, to not seek actively martyrdom, but to, take it if it does come to them, to weather persecution with faithfulness.
Oh, and he launches a new religious order.
Right. And he urges people to join this new order of Christ crucified that you can join. It's not limited to religious or priests. Lay people join the order. It's a way of
being willing to stand up and be martyred.
Exactly.
To stand up for your faith in whatever context you find, and to take the vow that when put to the test, that you will stand up for Christ and accept martyrdom.
And also obedience to the Pope and to doing what is necessary, and to the bishops throughout the world. And so the Pope is urging people to do that. He's certainly not urging them to fight back or to commit violence.
And then there becomes this precipitating event, as you said, which is the sort of a reminiscent of the Guy Fawkes gunpowder plot.
Right.
That supposedly Catholics are going to blow up not the Houses of Parliament, but in this case, Westminster Abbey or something like that.
Yeah. I think it's St. Paul's, because that's where they're holding the new.
Whether that's true or not, or it's a fabrication or whatever, that becomes the pretense now for Felsenburg to make his move once and for all against the Church and the Pope.
Right. And so Father Franklin, who has been in Rome in his new position, hurries back to England in order to try to head this off and to do what he can. And as he's going from Rome to England, he sees coming from England to Rome this huge fleet of
airships,
warships.
Yeah.
And so Felsenburg, seeing this threat and looking to destroy the Church, essentially nukes Rome. It's not nukes, but
they don't have nukes yet. But basically, he
has
these kind of airplanes, how you imagine airplanes would be, and they like these airships, and they kind of fly over and they basically drop bombs on Rome and reduce it to rubble.
Yeah. So Benson is anticipating the ability of militaries to do this aerial bombing to destroy Rome. And so in that aftermath, you now only have three cardinals in the world. The Pope died in Rome. You have Father Franklin himself, who is a cardinal. You have the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and then you have a German cardinal who was with him at the time. And so they're the only ones left who can elect a pope, and they elect Father Franklin as Pope Sylvester, I believe, the third.
Yeah. Now, in the meantime, Felsenburg thinks he's wiped out the Church, and he as the Antichrist now believes that he has the capacity to take final control of the world religiously, and that's when he institutes what he calls the Test Act, which is to require that every citizen of the world show up periodically and make an act of worship to essentially Felsenburg and Humanist and as the Messiah of the world.
Right. And at this point, that's punishable by death if you don't.
If you don't do it, you're punished by death. And so massive persecution breaks out all around the world. Catholics are slain, they're butchered, priests are hung, by the neck until dead in churches. I mean, the most just egregious persecution that's reminiscent of the worst persecutions, or a culmination of all the persecutions that had taken place for 2,000 years.
And it's very interesting because you have this character of Mabel Brand, who is
we got to talk about her.
Yeah, we got to talk about her because she's a true believer in this new religion and adores Felsenburg. And a big part of what has been said by Felsenburg is that humanity has come to a new age. Violence is no longer how we're going to solve problems. This is an era of peace. And yet she's also seeing these horrific persecutions that are not being stopped by the government. And this is a sort of crisis of faith for her in this new religion.
Yeah, it's interesting because we talked about 1984 and Orwell, and in his book Animal Farm, there's a similar sort of thing, which is that when the pigs, who are the Marxists, take over the farm, they promise peace and freedom from labor, but then the burden becomes even worse on the other animals, and the pigs began to point out that not all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And in the end, you find that the promises of peace and equality and harmony, which again, this leftist humanitarian religion, that's their selling point. It actually turns out to be historically, Marxist socialist regimes have been among the most brutal, especially towards Christians in history. It always ends in Christians being martyred.
Right. And Felsenburg actually rationalizes this, or comes out with a doctrine to justify it by saying that because we worship humanity in aggregate, and because Christianity is essentially a cancer on the body of humanity, it is opposing everything that we think will build this new era. We must get rid of Christians.
You have to cut out the cancer.
You're right. It's simply healing a disease in order to kill.
Which is exactly what Lenin and later on Stalin said in Russia. It's exactly what Mao said in China. It's exactly what Fidel said in Cuba. It's exactly what the leftist, the Marxist government of Mexico said when they started in the Cristoro War.
Well, it's actually quite similar to what the Roman authorities said, that the Christians are the enemy of mankind.
Right, because the Romans, in many ways, the Roman imperial cult was a precursor to that. It was collectivist. It worshipped the state, and it worshipped the emperor as the embodiment of the state. So in any case, now it's really kind of come to this last battle, and Christians, Catholics in particular, are told by the Pope, the new Pope Sylvester, to stand at the time of testing. And that means that just as Jesus says, there will become persecutions. And when it's your time to decide whether to manifest your belief in Christ and accept, the good death of martyrdom, the Christian should stand, but not all do. Now, Pope Sylvester is on the run. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so he's now underground. It's actually not known to Felsenburg and to the government at first that there is a pope. They think that they have killed all of the cardinals and there is now no head of the church. And so he ends up taking up his abode in Nazareth.
Yeah. Okay. So this is interesting because Benson, in the last part of the novel, draws on all of this biblical imagery. So Nazareth, if people are unfamiliar with the geography of Israel, the place where Jesus grew up, but as the crow flies or whatever, it's not more than 20, 30, 40 miles from Mount Carmel, where Elijah contended with the prophets of Baal. It's not more than same distance to not only the Sea of Galilee, but Mount Tabor, where the Transfiguration took place. And interestingly, it's just adjacent to the plain of Megiddo,
better known as Armageddon.
Armageddon, the place where the final battle between Christ and Antichrist will take place. And so now Pope Sylvester is kind of in hiding in the town of Nazareth.
Right. And so you have this pope who's in hiding, who physically looks identical to the Antichrist, the world leader who has come to power. And so you have this very blatant sort of juxtaposition of these two opposing forces. And what you end up having is that in the context of the worship being made mandatory and punishable by death if you don't comply, that one of the cardinals, because the Pope has made new cardinals at this point.
Interestingly, there are how many?
12.
There are 12 cardinals.
So to mirror the 12 apostles, one of them turns Judas and betrays him.
To Felsenburg, tells him, in particular, Benson makes this explicit in the book. He says he Dabrowski, I think it was the name of the cardinal,
Mm-hmm.
the Cardinal of Moscow, tells them where you can find the Pope,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that Judas told the Sanhedrin where the temple guards might find Jesus hiding. So he betrays that, and then Felsenburgh decides to cut out this cancer once and for all.
Go in for the final kill. And so he organizes again a fleet of warships to go and bomb out of existence the Pope.
It's interesting because, again, tying into those prophecies of Armageddon, Felsenburgh requires every nation in the world to send an airship representative, so that all the nations, and he will lead the force, personally standing on the front of the first airship. And so the Antichrist is coming in the air over the plain of Armageddon with all of the forces of the world arrayed around him. And then
and so the Pope receives word of this. He knows that it is coming, and what he decides to do is to stay put, to celebrate Mass, and then to hold a Eucharistic procession as the warships are coming in. And so they're processing with him holding the Eucharist in the monstrance.
Oh, and this is cool too, right? So as it nears this final day, there's earthquakes all around the world.
Sure, yeah, and unnatural heat.
And natural weather, and the sky gets dark. So all of these prophecies about the last day and the coming of Christ and the Battle of Armageddon are all coming true.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Pope Sylvester, Percy Franklin, the protagonist novel, recognizes at this point that what he's living through now is the last battle.
Mm-hmm. And so you have the warships coming in, this Eucharistic procession happening, because the Pope realizes what is happening and that this is the end. And then you end with a line.
Do we want to tell people how it ends?
Do we? I don't know. You said spoilers are fair game.
All right. Well, so
we also should probably go back at some point and talk about the end of the Mabel Brand.
Yeah, we'll go back to that. But basically, what I think is interesting, because as I was getting, the first time I read this book, as I was getting to the last couple of pages, I was like, wow, because I know what the Bible foretells about that battle, right? Which is what Scripture foretells about that battle, is that the forces of Antichrist are arrayed there. It's the end of the world, and then Christ returns. And this time he's no longer the meek Jesus. He is the rider on a horse that is, a white rider on a horse that is faithful and true, who comes in and brings this age to an end. So, I was like, well, what's going to happen here? And I'll let you, I'll let you tell it in. Put your fingers in your ears if you don't want to, or hit mute if you don't want to hear how it ends.
Well, in short, he doesn't try to portray Christ's return. He simply uses a line in Latin that essentially translates to "and then passed the world in all its glory." Yeah,
and so basically, Felsenburgh and the Antichrist comes over and drops, basically bombs on the last Pope and the last of the church, who are, as you say, are adoring the Eucharist. And as the bombs fell, it says, then the world came to an end.
And we're not told, exactly what form that takes, but we are to believe that Christ does return.
So what's interesting about this book, so many things that are interesting about this book, but one of them is that we started this episode by saying that it was science fiction. And it is only in the sense that it's a projection into the future. And he does imagine some things like they'll have airplanes and telephones. But really what it's about is it's a telling of the coming of the Antichrist in the last days.
Trying to imagine what that could look like.
What that would actually look like. And he foretells, reading in 1907, that by around, now, the Antichrist is here.
Which, of course, that it hasn't happened that way. I'm sure he didn't expect it to happen exactly that way. But the more important thing is to imagine how it might and how we could respond.
What would the coming of the Antichrist look like? What would it mean for the church? What would it mean for ordinary Christians, ordinary Catholics? Let's go back to that Mabel character.
Yeah.
So she's the wife of one of the central characters in the book is, as you say, an English politician named Oliver Brand, who becomes, in a sense, co-opted into serving the Antichrist. And that's
willingly,
willingly. But that's a whole interesting thing there about how one becomes co-opted, and there's other characters that do as well. But he has this wife who kind of goes along to a point, and then she becomes, as you said, disgusted And one of the central plot points in the book earlier on, and I think this shows sort of the antithesis of their humanistic collectivist religion versus Catholicism, because they're really into abortion, euthanasia, and we assume abortion, because any human life that's inconvenient should, for the good of for the good of the whole, be extinguished.
Right. You have a scene very early on where there's an accident with one of the flying ships, and what you see, instead of medics coming out to care for the injured, is you have the euthanasia practitioners
squad. There's like this euthanasia squad, and like you say, when there's an accident on the roadside or whatever, it isn't doctors coming to save people. It's coming basically triage and go, just put them down.
And there's also a law in which anyone who wants, after a short waiting period of I believe a week, can have voluntary euthanasia.
They actually have euthanasia. Any reason. They have euthanasia centers everywhere. So you don't have nursing homes where old people go. You just have euthanasia centers. And when, your time has come, or you're tired of living, or, the burdens of life are too much or whatever, you just go to the euthanasia center and they let you put yourself down.
Right.
And now, see, that's where a lot of this stuff is not as crazy and far-fetched. I mean, Benson saw the direction that this is, I think, really important. When we talk about thesis and antithesis, Catholicism versus that in some sense Marxism, socialism becomes an antithesis to it, this sort of humanistic religion. The notion that, one of the notions of Catholicism, of course, is the preciousness of human life and the imago Dei in human life. And of course, that's utterly and completely and unreconcilably opposed to a collectivist humanistic definition of life.
Right.
So Mabel decides she can't take it anymore, and she goes and checks herself into a euthanasia center. Why don't you tell that story, because it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting, because she really is a true believer. She's very disturbed by the violence that has come about against the Christians, but she can't really bring herself to disbelieve in the new religion. She doesn't convert to become a Catholic. It's just that she can't handle it. And she's disillusioned, and she feels that she is not really an asset to this humanity anymore. And her emotional pain is such that she wants to simply end it, and doesn't see any reason why not.
Well, and sees no moral reason why not. When a human life is no longer useful to the collective, it's just removed, like sloughing off dead skin cells or cutting out your appendix when it's no longer useful.
Right, and that it's actually of benefit to the rest of the body of humanity. And so she goes to this center. She undergoes her waiting period. She doesn't have any doubts. She doesn't rethink or get cold feet. And then there's this very interesting scene in which she actually does do it, and
they basically give you a gas mask, and you put it on, and you push the button and take your own life, right?
And you have this very, very interesting kind of ambiguous death scene for her, in which she's fading out, and she sees something and kind of goes, "Oh." And
as she slips out of consciousness, he describes her inner thoughts or experience, and it really hints, because at the end she goes, "Wait a minute, it's what I never thought. And then it kind of ends like that, and it's ambiguous. What was she seeing? Was she seeing hell or heaven? I mean, she sees the beginning of the afterlife, and this was controversial in Benson's book. And I read that he answered a lot of letters from readers over the years as a Catholic priest about what it is that Mabel saw. And there are people like, well, the Catholic Church teaches that suicide is obviously a mortal sin. But Benson said, well, he left ambiguity in it because she didn't know it was a sin. She had never been educated in Catholicism.
And for a sin to be mortal, you do have to do it with awareness
and consciousness of it. And weirdly, at the very end, as she's slipping, she's going to take her life, and as she's slipping away, she kind of prays to God. She's, "God, I don't know if you exist, but if you do, I just hope that it'll all be okay." And so Benson, in some letters, said to readers in subsequent years after he wrote the book, again, if she's not conscious of that it's a mortal sin, nobody ever catechized her to teach her that, and she made whatever kind of feeble attempt at prayer that she could from sort of natural religion. And he doesn't say that she's in heaven, but he doesn't say that she's in hell.
Right.
He leaves it up to the judgment of God.
And it's interesting. It's kind of a an instance of what the church calls invincible ignorance, perhaps, is that based on what she's been taught and her society and her culture, she doesn't really have the ability to explicitly convert.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing about the Mabel story arc that's interesting is, on the one hand, she is an example of despair, and that, again, I know I'm leaning pretty hard on the Marxism, socialism, and humanitarianism thing, but that's what the book is about. So I'm just basically, I think, in the context of the book, that's what Benson sees as the threat. It's antithetical to Catholicism, and that ideology, that combination of political, religious ideology, that worldview, ultimately leads to nothing but despair. So I think that's one thing interesting, about the Mabel character. And the other one is this notion of natural religion, that you get into this whole thing of, well, what happens when someone has never heard the gospel? What happens when someone has never been taught morality? Or
it's been so misrepresented to them.
Yeah, and so if they reach out, in some desperate sense to the God that they can vaguely know through nature, does God credit any of that to righteousness? And the church is ambiguous about that. The church makes no sound declaration.
Right.
Sound. It makes sound, but it makes no definitive declaration.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't rule out the idea that God can save such people, but we can't really know, and it's dangerous to. It's
a conversation for another kind of episode, because the doctors of the church over the centuries have kind of meandered a little bit up around that point. So takeaways from this book, and why somebody would want to read it, and what your major takeaways are.
Yeah, so I think one is that it's really just interesting to look at it through the lens of how the church and how individual Christians respond in this persecution, and the fact that the individuals are urged not to actively antagonize the hostile state, but to stand firm and to take the persecution or the martyrdom if it is given to them, because they are standing firm. And I think that most listeners will not be living in a place where this is an active question right this minute, but there are places in the world where it is, and there always will be until the end does come. And so I think it's worth reflecting on that and praying and using this as an opportunity to ask the Lord for the faith and the steadfastness in order to stand in persecution of any level of intensity.
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely underline that. For me, I think the takeaways of the book are how biblical it is, in the sense that Benson really does unpack a lot of scripture without explicitly doing it, sort of portraying how scriptural prophecies and principles might play themselves out in the world, particularly what the spirit of Christ and the spirit of Antichrist look like, what those worldviews and ideologies look like, and that the church, that much of what we see today is the antithesis, in a very technical sense of the term. It's the mirror image opposite of Catholic ideology and of Christianity and the gospel. And that at the end, we all have to make a choice. Will we stand for Christ or Antichrist? And are we willing to pay the price? And if we do end up living in the last times, are we willing to stand for Christ if it costs us everything? Yeah.
But even because obviously most ages in this world are not the end times, but we're constantly having dress rehearsals, and even in our own lives or in the life of the world, for what that will look like, because the spirit of Antichrist, the enemy is always at work. And so I think there are some helpful pointers in the book, like what we said about the ideology that values the collective at the expense of the individual. And of course, Catholicism has a robust respect for the common good and wanting a just society. But when it becomes at the expense of the individual, and the individual is devalued and not respected for the image of God that they bear, that is a pretty obvious tell. And I think there's plenty of things in our society that ought to raise red flags for us as Catholics along those lines.
I just want to point out to anyone who's listening that there's an important distinction between Marxism, socialism, leftism, humanitarianism, as we're describing it, as Benson describes it in the book, and Catholic social teaching. And I did an entire episode on this. So one of the types of episodes that we periodically do are the worldviews. And if you search in the archives, I did an episode on Marxism as a worldview that is antithetical to Catholicism. So if you're curious about that, I'd recommend that, because I think for a lot of people today, when you say Marxism, socialism, you sound like some kind of a, American right winger, and you're opposed to caring for the poor or whatever. And nothing could be further from the truth of Catholicism. Catholicism invented, in a sense, the social conscience and care of the poor. But there is a worldview and ideology that I think people they come for the care of the poor, and it always ends up somewhere different. So listen to that episode if you're curious. So as we talk about the takeaways for that, frame this for me at the end here, Cory, just why the last two popes maybe perhaps have so strongly recommended this book. Because Francis has recommended it on multiple occasions, and so did Benedict XVI.
Yeah, I think it's because the kind of social, political, cultural currents that were at work 100 years ago have simply continued to be at play in our society. They've, evolved and mutated in various ways, but it hasn't become irrelevant. And I think the popes understand that, is that you have certainly different kinds of Marxism and socialism or other ideologies influenced or descended from them that are looking to establish a kind of, again, when you say the phrase New World Order, you sound like a tinfoil hat guy, but that are actually looking to establish some kind of state or authority.
And they want to reorganize
Yeah.
their role as globalism. I mean, frankly, it was pretty explicit. Benedict XVI, when he recommended this book, saw it as a warning against globalism, the globalist elite, and the formation of global states, which would crush the individual and crush Catholicism. And Francis said much of the same sort of thing in different ways on the several occasions that he's strongly recommended this book. In fact, I think it was right after his ascension to the papacy that Francis recommended this book very strongly if people wanted to understand what he thought he was going to be all about.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a healthy debate in politics about what the role of things like the United Nations or international bodies are. It's not to say that anything that's international is by definition bad, but that when you have the idea of an authoritarian regime that is overall captive to these kinds of secular ideologies, that can't but end in something that's bad for individuals, and that is also opposed to the teachings of the church.
Yeah. So, final thoughts as we check out here about this book that you want to say to any of the listeners?
I would recommend that you read it. I think it's helpful. It's good context for understanding both the religious and cultural currents of when he wrote it, but also our own day and the history in between. I think that reading about persecution, even in fictional context, is helpful, because that's always going to be, to one degree or another, the reality of the church in different parts of the world. And I think it is really just a very interesting book. So I would recommend it.
Absolutely. The last two popes have recommended it. So
so don't take my word for it.
Yeah, don't take my word for it. The only thing I would say to a contemporary reader is I give this book sort of an A+ on the content. I think that it is a book written in 1907. So if you're used to contemporary novels, just in the kind of pacing and phrasing and literary style, it is a 1907 novel, and it has a lot of the literary conventions of a 120-year-old book. It's not written like a Left Behind novel or a page turner, but it's a fascinating book, and you can tear through it in a few days or a week if you want to. Couldn't recommend it more strongly. So the next time we'll come back, and I think we'll be doing some more of this sort of Catholic science fiction and some upcoming ones with Michael O'Brien's Voyage to Alpha Centauri and Canticle for Leibowitz by Miller, right?
Yes, Walter Miller Jr.
Yeah, and some other things that may be on the horizon as well. So thanks, Cory.
Yep, very good. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. My name is Greg Smith. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, would you please hit the like and subscribe buttons wherever you get your podcasts? And please share it with others. And if you're curious about the Catholic worldview and faith, the Church and its saints, or Catholic history, culture, and art, then visit consideringcatholicism.com. And email me to let me know what you think. Greg@consideringcatholicism.com.